When Charles had finished picking over the remains of the bugs he had been able to collect, his energy storage space had doubled, and he felt the urge to fill it up. I'm getting paranoid about running out of supplies, he thought, sighing to himself. Over the last few days, he had collected and stored 6 months' supplies for 2,000 people. All kinds of daily necessities were already piled up high, but he was still worried about not having enough. Of course, these days, everyone feared running out of food, so he wasn't alone in that concern. Meanwhile, he had discovered that a small pond had appeared in his energy storage space, and he decided he would have to study it later. After sorting through most of the dead bugs, Charles dissected some of them, not because he wanted to study them, but to take their meat. I'm really not interested in these nasty insects, he thought, but all those people outside will be wondering why I've got this massive pile of bug bodies, so I'll tell them I'm studying them. That'll keep them quiet. Even after the bugs had mutated, they still didn't contain much meat. A bug the size of a human head only produced a very small amount of meat, so dismembering the insects to extract it was a very meticulous task. Charles kept the hard parts of the insect bodies, such as the wings and jaw, thinking, I better hang on to these, they'll be useful in the future. When everyone saw Charles cutting up the remains of the insects, they were puzzled, but no one questioned him. His ability to help people survive had been demonstrated on several occasions, so everyone simply assumed he believed the insect remains would be of use in some way. When conflicts had broken out among people collecting the bugs, Olivia had been able to resolve things quickly, so Charles was satisfied with her performance. The few military personnel who had come with Kevin began to lose their tempers, and after a while, one walked over to Charles. Despite his obvious anger, he tried his best to remain calm as he said, Tony Hughes is dead. Sadness crossed Charles's face. I know, he replied. He had thought he was used to death, but news of an acquaintance's demise still had the power to upset him. Every fighter knows they might die to protect the people they serve, he thought, trying to comfort himself. In the post-apocalyptic era, such a death was seen as one of the most honorable, so if someone was going to die, then that was the way to go. The soldier frowned. Officer Hughes' sacrifice came about because the people began to panic, and then someone pushed him right into the middle of the bug swarm. Anger flooded Charles at the news. Is the person who did this dead? He demanded. If they're not already dead, then they very soon will be, he thought. The soldier replied. Because of the deaths of Officer Hughes and his soldiers, there was a breach in the defense line. More than 5,000 people under the protection of the military also died. In their anger, the military killed everyone who was causing trouble. We've received orders to kill anyone who threatens the lives of others. Charles began to calm down a little. The army was strong, and they had a great number of troops and experts, so they could offer everyone protection. Charles knew that the death of civilians was never pretty, but if the military allowed themselves to be killed, then there would be no one left to protect everyone else. He thought about what had happened in his previous life, when the bugs had attacked the fortress, and all the soldiers had been killed. He had previously believed that those soldiers had died because they had been fulfilling their duties, but after this incident, he began to wonder if that had really been what had happened. If he hadn't reminded Kevin to prioritize teaching cultivation techniques to the military, then the army could have been completely wiped out, and that would have been a dreadful tragedy. No wonder the army changed their way of doing things after that incident, Charles thought. If Lewis hadn't had my help, then he would have died last night, even if he did have 5th-tier superpowers. He felt relieved that Lewis had survived. He turned to look at the soldier. Are you going back to the army? The soldier shook his head. I have reported your conversation with Kevin to the senior commanders, he said. They've ordered us to stay by your side to act as a liaison. Obviously, we will have to report everything that happened here. Likewise, any intelligence the military manages to obtain will be shared by the senior commanders as soon as possible. Of course, you can refuse to cooperate, and then we'll leave immediately. This is obviously a surveillance tactic by the military's senior commanders to keep tabs on me, thought Charles. But it won't stop me from achieving my aims. If all I have to agree to is the military monitoring my operations, then that's a fair trade to get information from them. Military intelligence has played a crucial role in a lot of situations, so I'll be able to benefit significantly from this deal. Sure, he said. I don't have anything to hide here, so monitor me all you like, but don't report back about any personal matters. He had no intention of allowing them to discover any of his personal business, so he wasn't worried about the military's presence here. In fact, having some soldiers around might even prove useful. As far as he was concerned, if ordinary people got their hands on guns, then they would be more likely to injure each other than the enemy, so it was better that the military was involved. As Charles and the soldier finished their discussion, they could hear a commotion nearby. Without waiting for Charles to give any orders, Olivia discovered what was going on and reported back to him. Then Charles called Elena, who was badly injured, over to him. "Didn't I tell you that you need to be careful if you want to stay safe and well?" he asked, frowning at her. Elena bowed her head. "My martial arts progress is too slow, and I was impatient to grow stronger." Charles knew her skills were not as basic as she seemed to think. Only those who had already cultivated before the disaster were at a higher level than she was. Elena cultivated dangerously quickly, with little regard for the dangers. Desperate to grow as strong as possible, she had come close to death on more than one occasion. Apart from Charles, she had the greatest lust for killing monsters, and she had been using the cores she had taken from them. Charles had been forced to save her time and time again from her self-inflicted injuries. Seeing the determination in her eyes, Charles hesitated for a moment, and then he said, "I can grant you the opportunity to become a paranormal, but there will be a price to pay." Elena's eyes lit up. "He's willing to let me become a paranormal," she thought. Wide-eyed, she asked him, "What do I have to do? No matter what the price is, I'm willing to pay it. I will kill as many monsters as you want." She knew Charles firmly believed in fair exchanges for his assistance, but she also knew that his help was a guarantee of survival. Tina and the others had heard the conversation and walked over, all talking at once. "But we're the ones who have been with you the longest. Shouldn't we have the opportunity to become paranormals first? I want to become a paranormal too. Please tell me what to do." Tommy, Hank, and Hugh were worried. They were close to Charles, but when they saw someone else being given the chance to become a paranormal, they began to doubt their importance to him. And if there really was a chance to become a paranormal, then of course they wouldn't let it pass them by. At that time, there were only two ways to become a paranormal. The first was to awaken naturally, but that wasn't something anyone could control. The second was to be given a superpower passed on by a dying paranormal, but such examples were all too few. To sacrifice a paranormal was a serious matter, as they were not easily replaced. Charles shook his head. "You have been with me the longest, and I definitely could awaken you, but it's too dangerous. I'm not sure you're ready, and the process requires someone to test it." At the idea of becoming guinea pigs, some of them grew more hesitant, but for others, it would be worth the risk to become a paranormal. Charles continued, "I put all my energy into training you rather than the paranormals, because you have potential. You don't think I would do something that was a waste of my time, do you?" They all relaxed. After all, they all understood Charles, and they knew that if he was willing to help them, then that meant he considered them of possible use to him in the future. Tina nodded and said, "I trust him." "Me too," Hugh said. Tommy also agreed. Besides, even if they didn't trust him, there was nothing they could do about that. Not if they wanted to take advantage of what he could teach them. Charles took a bottle of water and handed it to Elena. "Drink this," he said, "and then tell me how you feel." Elena gulped down the water, and then she focused on her wounds for a few moments. "My injuries seem a little better," she said. "The pain has reduced, and I feel like I did when you used the rejuvenation amulet the last time." Charles wasn't sure exactly when the small pond had appeared in his energy storage space, but when he had examined it, he had soon determined that it consisted of an unusual liquid. Unable to take the entire pond out of storage, he had come up with the idea of pouring it into water bottles, and during the process, he had realized that when he mixed it with ordinary water, he was able to heal infections and injuries. Such a thing had never happened in his previous life, so clearly, his cultivation path was different this time. Still, the healing effects of the water were not as strong as the abilities of paranormals. He picked up a bowl which appeared to be filled with small chunks of meat. Then he handed it to Elena and ordered, "Eat this." Elena ate it without hesitation, but right away, everyone could see that she was in pain. She felt like she was swallowing razor blades, but she gritted her teeth, determined to eat every last piece. After she had finished, she opened her mouth to say something, but then she suddenly dropped the bowl, screaming in agony. She collapsed to the ground, holding her throat and writhing on the ground. Tina turned to Charles. "What on earth did you give her to eat?" she asked. Charles shrugged. It's the meat from the dead bugs. At that, everyone felt a little sick. But I heard that the meat of these insects is poisonous, Harper exclaimed. Anyone who eats it dies, and there's no cure. She knew that when people were starving, they often ate whatever they could find, even tree bark or insects. But anyone who had tried to eat meat from this particular kind of insect had died. Not a single one of them had survived. Charles had fed Elena so much insect meat that no one expected her to survive. The insect meat isn't poisonous, Charles assured them. It's just that most people's bodies are too weak to withstand the energy contained in the bugs. Have you ever heard of any paranormals who got into trouble eating them? Harper shook her head. No paranormal would eat insect meat. In the current era, when the strong often preyed on the weak, paranormals could always survive better than anyone else, so they hadn't had to resort to eating the bugs. There were some people in the fortress who had tried to weaponize food against the paranormals, but such people had been killed, and the others had fled to Charles for protection from them. But Charles had looked down on them. As far as he had been concerned, if people didn't have the ability to protect themselves, then they should join the military. He hadn't understood why such people had placed their faith in unknown paranormals instead. Elena's body kept twitching, and she looked terrible. But as Charles silently passed the rejuvenation amulet over her, she slowly began to recover. As they watched, Tina and the others started to wonder if becoming a paranormal was such a good idea, and they thought it might be easier to run away. Harper's face was very pale. Is the transformation always so scary? She asked. If it is, she thought, even I don't think I'm brave enough to try. No, everyone is different, replied Charles. But before anyone could sigh with relief, he shattered their hopes once again. Elena was already very close to being a paranormal, he said, so the pain she is suffering is less than it would be for anyone else. Everyone's faces grew even paler, and they didn't doubt what Charles had said. It seemed that the closer someone was to already being a paranormal, the easier it was to bear the pain of the process. But considering how much Elena was suffering, they didn't want to even consider what kind of pain they would have to bear if they decided to go through with it. After a moment, Charles passed Elena some of the special water, and after drinking it, Elena's expression eased a little. Then Charles passed her a bowl of black soup, which looked awful and smelled even worse. But although Elena was still trembling and her instinct was to reject it, she was determined to drink it. Charles watched her, noticing how hard her hands were shaking. Since you can't hold it steady, he said, I'll feed it to you. He held the bowl, tipping the soup into her mouth, simultaneously using an extract amulet on her. The medicinal paranormals of the apocalypse were divided into two categories. The first was the bio-altered paranormals, and the second was the elemental type. Bio-altered paranormals were the stronger of the two, but the elemental types were still much stronger than ordinary people. As for the martial artists, they concentrated on changing their bodies. In the post-apocalyptic era, essence, energy, and spirit were capable of being materialized, and they could be transformed into each other through changes in their form. Paranormals were distinguished by their inner energy, and their physiques and spirits were stronger than that of ordinary people. In anyone who had potential, their energy could rotate and help them awaken as paranormals. Others could not awaken because of their lack of talent, but more importantly, they were unable to convert the essence, energy, and spirit needed to become a paranormal. If they wanted to become stronger, then they could pile on more muscle, but they could not form the rotation of essence and spirit. No matter how physically strong they would not be able to awaken as paranormals. The amulet Charles had used could forcefully convert body energy into spirit energy, but the conversion involved vast amounts of energy, and if a normal person was hit by it, then they would usually die on the spot. The things Charles had fed to Elena had been to replenish her energy, and they were also the embryonic form of the genetic enhancement pill. Since the pill was still in its early stages of development, it was not yet safe to administer it to anyone yet. Elena cried out in pain. No matter how tough she was, she couldn't stop herself from writhing in agony. She felt as if her body were about to explode, and her shrill screams terrified the onlookers. Harper and Tina couldn't even look at her anymore. Hold on, Elena, Charles urged her. If you can hold on, then you'll have a chance to awaken. But if you pass out, you will never again have a chance to become a paranormal, and my investment in you will have failed. A determined look appeared in Elena's eyes, and she clenched her teeth. Under the effect of the medicine, her entire body became covered in wounds. Everyone else trembled with fear. Hugh sighed and said, "Will anyone who doesn't have talent have to experience such pain if they want to become a paranormal? What a dreadful process." Everyone silently agreed with him. A paranormal was powerful by nature. Although Charles's group had already reached the limits of human endurance, they were still unable to surpass a paranormal. There was simply a natural gulf between ordinary people and paranormals. Charles replied, "The world is unfair, and it always has been, but there are still many innately weak people who just cannot be bothered to make an effort to improve themselves. Instead, they spend their time complaining about life. The strong never give up, no matter how hard the fight." It had been the same in his previous life. No matter how much despair he had experienced, he had never given up. Even if he had become physically incapable of fighting, he would still not have given up hope of survival. Perhaps there were people who persisted, but still didn't get anywhere. But there was no other choice. They had to keep trying, or they wouldn't survive. In this new era, food and warm clothing would be scarce, so anyone who wasn't prepared to fight for what they needed would be doomed. Elena's screams gradually calmed down. She hadn't gotten used to the pain, but she no longer had the strength to scream. Her body was still racked with pain, but her expression was stoical. Everyone was moved by her obvious determination not to yield to the pain. They wondered what kind of experiences she had been through that had left her with such a tenacious will. Finally, Elena began to feel better. The awful wounds on her body had disappeared, and her skin had returned to normal. Charles handed her another bottle of the special water and checked her out. "A metal-attributed paranormal of the bio-altered type," he announced. "This is a superpower that specializes in killing. It seems that the process takes your character into account. The metal-attributed superpower can repair and forge many pieces of equipment, so you won't have to worry about your weapons being damaged." Elemental power was divided into several types, but most of the bio-altered and close combat paranormals had no other attributes. A few of them had one of the 5 elements, and they had special abilities. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice weak. Charles thought for a moment, and then he took a weapons belt from the car. There were 13 different types of weapons on it, including 9 hidden weapons. He passed the belt to Elena and said, "This is my own personal set of weapons. It can be used to deal with various kinds of enemies, and it's very useful in all sorts of situations. It is my gift to you. You can think of it as an advance payment." Charles had prepared the set of knives for himself a few days ago, but he had decided to give them to Elena in recognition of her awakening as a paranormal. The knives were made of the finest steel, and there were other weapons that he had made from materials collected from zombies and wild beasts. Those weapons couldn't be damaged by fire. Charles thought Elena would have more use for the belt because he didn't intend to waste time killing the smaller monsters that these weapons were useful for. On the way to the fortress, he'd been in a desperate situation several times. He had been suffering from exhaustion and might have died had it not been for the lightning cadaver serpent. Alice's combat skills had helped, but they hadn't been strong enough. There was a limit to the use of her superpower, and she was unable to withstand a prolonged battle. Elena, however, was a weapon that Charles planned to nurture, and as far as he was concerned, she belonged to him. Elena fastened the weapons belt around her waist, noticing the envious gazes of the others. She took out a white bone knife. Its surface was as smooth as a mirror, and it was sharp enough to cut easily, even through the toughest surface. Alice looked at Charles warily, hoping that he still respected her and hadn't forgotten about her skills. Some of the young men gathered their courage. "Do you have any more of those special knives?" one of them asked. "I'd love to swap for one of them." "Me too," said another man. "And me," Oliver agreed. "I'd be really happy to have one." Watching from the sidelines, some of the others weren't so confident in speaking up, but they also wished they could have new knives. Charles looked at them. "Do you know why I gave Elena this set of weapons?" "Why?" asked one of the men. "Because she has given me a total of 235 crystal cores in the past week alone," Charles replied. "That was her payment for me awakening her to become fully paranormal. Do you know what that means?" The men looked at Elena with fear in their eyes. They knew that those who followed Charles always gave him half of what they scavenged, and they also knew that these people always came back with more than anyone else. But for Elena to have given him so many crystal cores, she must be some sort of killing machine. One man was unconvinced. If you gave me such a fine set of weapons, then I could easily bring you 300 crystal cores, he said, scowling. Charles sneered at him. But with such weapons, Elena would bring back 1,000 cores. So which of you do you think I should give the knife to? The man refused to back down, and Elena looked disparagingly at him, making him feel chilled to the bone. He quickly broke off eye contact, too afraid to challenge her. He suspected that if he continued questioning her, she would very likely kill him with her new knife. Within the Dawn Alliance, there must be no infighting, Charles shouted. We must not hurt each other. If you follow my orders, then I won't put any restrictions on you. But if you want anything from me, you must work for it. The Alliance won't take in anyone who doesn't work hard for the common good. At this, a few of the young men stepped back, but one of them turned to look at the swarm of bugs outside the protective shield. He didn't complain like the others, but wanted to prove his value to Charles. Just then, Olivia came back with some of the paranormals. She anxiously shouted to Charles, "Please help. I have injured people who need you, and there are still enemies following them." 3 of her paranormals had terrible wounds and broken bones. Olivia had relied on her strong willpower to get them back to safety, but it hadn't been easy. Alice and Sylvia looked at Charles. When he nodded, they immediately began to treat the injured paranormals. Once the 3 paranormals had been treated, they began to scream. They had relied on their strong survival instinct to temporarily block out the pain. Once they knew they were safe, the pain became unbearable. But thanks to Alice and Sylvia's skills, the 3 of them quickly recovered. Charles gave large amounts of medicinal crystal cores to the 2 of them, and Alice and Sylvia increased in strength. Alice's improvement surprised Charles. In training, she had been the weakest, and her absorption rate of medicinal crystal cores had also been the lowest. But as time passed, she improved very quickly and grew in strength. And as Alice grew more powerful, her talent also increased. Of course, it was also possible that the power had already been within her and had begun to wake. But Charles didn't have time to think further about Alice and Sylvia's progress, because he had other important things to deal with. Besides, he didn't particularly care about any of the Alliance members, viewing them simply as people who worked for him. But the previous night, they had given him a lot of bug corpses, so he knew they were useful to them, and he couldn't afford to ignore them completely. He turned his attention to Olivia and asked, "What's going on?" Olivia frowned. Some of the militants in the army have killed a great number of ordinary people, and there's been a riot. Thousands of people rebelled, and the Neal family seized the opportunity to expand their influence. Charles already knew the military had killed ordinary people. The army had zero tolerance for any troublemakers, knowing how easy it was for one rotten apple to spoil the whole barrel. There were always people who liked to cause trouble, and the Neal family had often taken advantage of such situations to drive a wedge between people and spread panic. Charles believed the Neal family could well have been behind this latest problem. There were more than 500,000 survivors in the fortress. Most of them were ordinary people who were under the control of the military. They were far inferior to members of the Dawn Alliance, who were actively advancing their cultivation and strength. A riot involving thousands of people was a serious blow to the military. "How did you get into conflict with them?" Charles asked. "They wanted us to be their slaves," one man said, scowling. "They've expanded their forces, killing anyone who refused to obey them. Obviously, we didn't want to join them, so they tried to kill us. If Olivia hadn't used her superpower to protect us, then we wouldn't have made it back alive." Olivia had unusually good spatial awareness, but she had also disguised her superpower as the bio-altered type and used a sword to fight. But whenever her companions were in danger, she didn't hide her spatial skills. Charles appreciated both her ability to hide her skills and her strength. After all, when someone knew how to hide their strength, it was easier for them to survive for a long time. The paranormal members were furious at the Neal family's action, and they began to call out, "They've gone too far this time! Do they think they can rule the whole world? Should we go and kill them?" Olivia held up her hands for silence. "Many small organizations have been forced to join the Neals," she said, "and we know they've killed a great many people, even those willing to join them and hand over their food supplies." At that, everyone got even angrier. Of course, they had also killed people, but in their case, it had been in self-defense and to protect their property. That was different from simply murdering anyone who opposed them. Charles's confidence in dealing with the Neals increased. He knew that coercion did not breed loyalty, so the Neal family's methods were stupid and doomed to fail. His own methods could be difficult, but they were much safer in the long run. He had absolute power, but he didn't use it to subdue his subordinates. Instead, he made them want to follow him and admire him. He wanted to inspire his followers, not terrify them into submission. After all, he knew that people responded to coercion in one of two ways. The weak would give up because they were cowardly. Such people would always turn tail and run at the slightest hint of danger, and that would never change. As a result, they would be easily taken advantage of by unscrupulous people, and would never know a day's true freedom in their miserable lives. The other response to coercion was the acceptance of authority. But although those people might appear to be submissive, they tended to turn on the leaders, leading to serious trouble. Either way, coercion simply didn't work, and the Neal family would eventually learn that the hard way. Olivia took out her camera and said, "I've gathered evidence of the Neal family's brutality. Thinking their actions would win the hearts and minds of the people present, they abused many people." Once again, there was an uproar among everyone present. Olivia continued, "In the face of these heartless animals, we have two choices now. One is to fight to the end, and the other is to defect to the Neal family. If anyone does want to go over to the Neal family's side, they're welcome to go. But be in no doubt that I will personally make them regret it. Anyone who wants to be associated with the Neals must be prepared for me to use my superpower against them." Everyone was inspired by her speech and yelled their agreement. "That's right! They're just a group of beasts! Even if we die, we won't be associated with them. Let's fight them to the death!" The hard evidence that Olivia had obtained resulted in everyone being furious with the Neal family. Kevin was standing to one side with a frosty expression on his face. He knew that there were many ambitious people in his family, but they were still his relatives, so he hadn't acted against them, but he hadn't expected them to behave in such a terrible way. Kevin took Olivia's camera to look for himself, and what he saw made him very upset. "I am ashamed to have been born into the Neal family," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I don't ever want to be associated with them again." Charles said, "If we want to unite a large force, then we must either establish a common goal for them, or give them a common enemy. The Neal family is forcing people to act against their better natures, and as long as there's no one to fight for them, their victims have no other choice." "They're probably responsible for the chaos in the military as well," Olivia pointed out. "With the senior commanders being so busy trying to keep everyone safe, they've taken their eye off the Neals." Kevin scowled. "No matter how many of them there are, I will—" "You can't beat them," Charles interrupted him. "I know you're not afraid of death, and you're ready to suffer for the sake of spreading your cultivation skills to those who need them. But if you die in vain, then who will avenge your death?" Kevin fell silent. Charles continued, "Don't think that this is just your problem to solve. We've decided to work together to create the survival base, so we'll ensure there's a place for everyone to live in safety. You might want to be a lone hero, but as a team, we'll have more success." "All right," Kevin said. "Let's work together and kill those animals." Charles heard someone laugh and looked up, realizing that some people had climbed onto a nearby roof to watch them. "Did you folks hear that?" one of the men on the roof asked. "They want to kill us all." "You want to lie to yourself with outsiders to deal with your own family?" called another. "Kevin, you're nothing but a traitor." Kevin took a step forward, but Charles grabbed his shoulder and said, "It's a trap." "I should be the one to go over there and talk to them," Kevin said. Charles replied, "I have a better solution." Then he took out a military sniper rifle, took aim, and fired. A gunshot rang out, and one of the soldiers on the rooftop stumbled and fell to the ground. Before the others could react, a loud bang tore through the air, and another soldier was hit. The remaining troops fled down through the building and hid, not daring to show themselves anymore. The Dawn Alliance crew and the bystanders who had gathered around them to take refuge burst into laughter. "What do you think you're doing? Don't you know we have guns here?" one of the Dawn Alliance men said. The truth was that even if the dissenters knew that the Dawn Alliance had weapons, the faction's rapid expansion had clearly led to internal power struggles that hindered their ability to fight, and unscrupulous people were looking to capitalize on the chaos to seize power themselves. Charles put away his sniper rifle and turned to a few of the military men. "Since you already have guns, I won't need to give you any of my weapons," he said. And now that you've seen evidence of the crimes these people committed, I'm sure you won't mind joining us, so we can deal with them together. We'll fight to the death at your command, shouted one of the soldiers, his voice filled with anger and determination. Kevin had shown them the evidence, and it had infused them with the will to fight, even if it meant risking their lives. I don't need you to fight to the death, Charles replied. What I want you to do is follow my orders diligently and kill every last one of them. Alice, you stay here. You're in command in my absence. With that, he left. Alice began shouting orders. Charles put me in charge for now, so listen up, everyone. You all need to quickly find a suitable hiding place and be ready to fight at any moment. The whole of the Dawn Alliance sprang into action. This was their first major offensive, and the group was beginning to show signs of cohesion. Charles crept stealthily behind the building where the enemies were hiding, and a dazzling pentagram symbol formed on the palm of his hand. He could hear the comrades of the men he had killed complaining. Why do they want to use us as bait when the enemy has sniper rifles? Don't they care if we die? One man said with a sigh. Another one chimed in. There's nothing we can do about it. The Neal family is so powerful that if we don't listen, they'll kill us. What if we escape instead? The Neals are supervising the whole army from behind. We can't escape. Charles knew from their doubts that it was a good moment to attack, and he quickened his pace. He understood the men's hesitation, but since Charles had vanished from sight, their supervisors had no intention of retreating, and the men would die in vain just like the others. Suddenly, the group found themselves surrounded by glowing pentagrams on the ground, and cries of panic and confusion rippled through the crowd. But unfortunately for them, the summoning formation had a soundproofing effect that prevented their screams from being heard, and in an instant, they were turned into bones, the perfect food for the hellish creatures that appeared and lowered their heads slightly to Charles as a sign of respect. Hell's Dark Mage, Hellhound, Dark Knights, and Skeleton Archers, Charles said as he addressed the hellish creatures, sizing them up. The sacrifice was pretty pathetic, but it summoned some real fearsome beasts. His eyes glimmered with satisfaction as he looked at the Hellhounds. Of all the Tier 3 beasts at his command, the Hellhound was the best at cleaning up corpses. But its appetite was so great that Charles usually had to send it back soon after summoning it. Dark Mages only needed a couple of sacrifices over the course of a few days to sustain themselves, whereas just one Hellhound needed 3 per day. Charles couldn't typically afford so many sacrifices, and so summoning a Hellhound was a rare treat for him. Charles went back to where his men were and commanded Alice, "Tell Olivia to move forward slowly and warn everyone not to get too close to the armored vehicles or they'll die." Alice nodded, and then she conveyed the orders to Olivia. When Kevin heard the orders, he set off toward Charles quickly, which worried Lena as she watched him go. Alice came over to Lena's side and said, "Quit wasting your energy worrying about that jerk and follow me." Lena nodded in agreement, feeling grateful for the support. Kevin arrived by Charles's side and asked, "What are you planning to do? Don't tell me you want to kill all those enemies at once." Charles said, "A mob is most vulnerable to panic. If we make them panic, they'll destroy themselves. All those who are ready to fight have to stand strong and gather their wits. This is the time for us to attack." Kevin nodded and said, "Don't be soft-hearted when you face the Neal family later either." Charles replied, "I don't need you to tell me that. I don't intend to be." Then he ordered a few of the beasts he had summoned from hell to attack, and they began killing the enemy and setting fires everywhere, taking no prisoners. Kevin asked worriedly, "How confident are you that we'll win?" "Don't worry, I'm sure I can destroy the Neal family," Charles replied. He knew they had made vital errors with their lack of foresight into the post-apocalyptic world. They naively thought that using force to coerce people, and then slowly brainwashing them later, was the right path. As Charles took in their combat formation, he saw another mistake they had made: treating people as if they were emotionless combat tools. It was clear they had been divided into teams in a hurried manner, and they hadn't had time to properly delegate individual roles. The Hellhound opened its bloody mouth and shot out a searing medicinal hellfire, burning everything in its path to ashes. Scores of martial artists were incinerated on the spot, and their cries echoed through the battlefield. "Help! Save me! There's a monster!" After witnessing this, the remaining soldiers immediately fled in panic, including a paranormal from the bio-altered type. "What are you running for? It's just a big dog!" Charles's men exclaimed triumphantly. Just as the Neal family behind them began to salvage the situation by regrouping the men, a gunshot rang out. As members of an ancient martial arts family, some of the Neals were naturally ambitious, but there were also righteous people like Kevin among their ranks. Unfortunately, people like Kevin were always kept at a disadvantage, which caused dissent within the family. As they were all faced with a chaotic situation, and most of them were desperately struggling to survive, there were some who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to enhance their standing. After we've cemented our position here, we can go to the spirit pool and make arrangements to expand our forces even further, George announced. Matthew replied, "You're right. Not everyone knows how to use the spirit pool to their advantage, and those lowly people are easy to use. We just need to give them a bite to eat, and they'll work hard for us." George said, "Exactly. When we give them food to eat, they'll be grateful to us. How can they complain when food is so scarce?" He let out a malicious chuckle as he looked at his family. As the Neals were discussing their future plans, good news came to them from the front lines as the number of forces they had at their disposal expanded. As for the issue of loyalty, the Neals knew that the simplest way to deal with dissenters would be to lure them to the spirit pond and make it impossible for them to escape. Then they would slowly instill them with new thoughts. Just as they were immersed in their beautiful fantasies of the future, a servant ran in a panic and shouted, "I have some bad news!" Matthew angrily rebuked, "Did you encounter some troublesome opponent while expanding the forces? Can't you idiots handle anything on your own?" George waved his hand and said, "Don't be too harsh on him." So Matthew asked, more gently this time, "Is it the Dawn Alliance?" The messenger said, "Yes, it's the Dawn Alliance." Sebastian flattered him. As expected, the head of the family has great foresight. But secretly, he was fed up with Matthew's pretentious behavior. He just targeted a few of the paranormals, he thought. Wasn't it obvious that they'd come back at him? The front line was probably already in a fight. However, he couldn't show his dissatisfaction openly. Matthew looked at the messenger and said, "We know already. Don't panic. Speak slowly." "Sir, there's been a fight on the front line," the messenger said, panting as he caught his breath. George looked calm and composed. A fight on the front line was exactly what he wanted. He knew that his army wasn't ready to handle it yet, and he saw an opportunity to cement his leadership. When he brought the elites of the Neal family to the battlefield and settled the situation, his reputation would skyrocket. As for the Dawn Alliance, although their reputation was unparalleled, as long as he pushed the blame for the fall of their fortress onto them, they would lose the people's respect. In any case, the will of the people was something they could manipulate with ease. They had a team that was very good at it. Seeing the calm look on George's face, the servant grew more confident to explain what had happened. "Many people on the front lines ran away when they encountered the enemy, causing a large-scale collapse," he said. But George already stabilized the situation. He sent the family's personal guards and killed several dissenters to establish his dominance. The servants were blindly faithful to the Neal family, and the look of confidence that George displayed made them believe that everyone was aware of his actions. Although they didn't know why the head of the family was allowing the front line to collapse, since everything was under his control, they didn't need to worry too much about it. They thought that perhaps it was a trap set up by the family to establish prestige. To the Neals, the pitiful Dawn Alliance was merely a motley crew. They were probably immersed in their dream of winning. What they didn't know was that George had arranged everything according to his own plans. "What did you just say?" Sebastian asked with a trembling voice. "Don't talk nonsense. What did you say about the front line?" The messenger was confused. "There are only a few minor problems at the front line," he said. "The poor soldiers who don't understand our power and our numbers advantage are running away as soon as they see the enemy, but George has assured us that he's already taken control of the situation." Sebastian felt his vision turn black. The messenger thought Sebastian's behavior was quite strange. If George isn't alarmed by the news, why is Sebastian so upset? He wondered. He took a breath to compose himself before continuing. "I'm afraid that the Dawn Alliance thinks that they've already taken control of the battle, as they've got our men running away in terror," he added. "But I'm sure this is all part of George's master plan." George stood in front of the messenger and said in a dangerous tone, "Stop with the lies." The messenger suddenly realized that he may have misread the situation. He felt a chill running up his spine, making his hair stand on end. He wanted to say something, but his teeth were chattering. "Did this matter?" George hit him in the chest, killing him instantly. Then he withdrew his palm and stood there proudly. "The Dawn Alliance only has 1,000 members," he said. "How can they be a match for us? Even if our army was made of 10,000 pigs, they couldn't possibly collapse in such a short time. Trying to use false information to disrupt my state of mind is a sick joke." He swept his gaze over the rest of the family, who were trembling with fear, and said, "Send another person to investigate. I want real information on the state of the front line." The others were also unwilling to believe this information, but they understood in their hearts that it was most likely true. It was impossible for their servants to lie to them so blatantly. George continued to act as if everything was under control. He sat at the head of the table, all high and mighty, waiting for further intelligence to arrive from the front line. Matthew suddenly stood up and said, "Sebastian and I will investigate immediately. Please rest assured we'll get to the bottom of this. We'll find the people who want to use false information to disrupt our morale and execute them." As he spoke, he pulled Sebastian with him and hurried out. "Grandpa, what's going on here?" Sebastian asked Matthew, as they scanned the chaotic battlefield around them. Matthew looked around carefully and said, "Can't you see? The front line has already collapsed. Shouldn't we hurry and prepare our escape?" George doesn't want to believe it, but it's clearly true. Of course, Sebastian could see it too, but he still had some hope. "George is the best chance we've got," he said. "With him around, we should be able to stabilize the situation." If they were defeated, then all their previous plans would have been in vain, and all that effort would have been for nothing. The Neal family was powerful, and their numbers were vast. They had always been proud of their unity, and the thought of losing to a ragtag band of misfits like the Dawn Alliance was too much for them to bear. Matthew sighed and said, "You don't even know how terrifying the collapse of morale on the battlefield is. Even a famous general would struggle to salvage the situation. George doesn't have the ability." "Would our men dare to rebel?" Sebastian asked. Matthew shook his head. "Not if they know what's good for them." At that moment, he saw a group of familiar figures walking toward them with George at the head of the group. When Sebastian saw George, he asked with a trembling voice, "How's the situation at the front line? Has it stabilized?" But George shook his head and said, "Unfortunately, it's completely out of control. The only chance of winning now is for us to kill the leader of the Dawn Alliance as soon as possible. If we can do that, we still have hope." Sebastian said, "Of course. So how do you propose we do that?" Matthew looked at him and raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it's possible that their leader would give such an opportunity in the current circumstances?" he asked. "I doubt he's that stupid or careless to leave himself open to attack while their victory is at hand. He also has Kevin helping him, so he knows insider information about our true strength." Sebastian struggled for a moment and said, "Let's give it a try by proposing a one-on-one fight. If they accept, we could still win. And if not, we should prepare a full retreat." Matthew thought for a moment and said, "All right then, let's give it our best shot. We can't just give up." Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the most capable fighters had already fled, and only those who weren't in a position to escape were left to assist the Neals in their plan. The remaining soldiers shouted to each other in panic as they ran for their lives. "Don't look back! Hurry up and run! They're about to catch up!" "Don't panic! There might not be as many enemies as we imagined." "Are we just going to stay and wait for death then?" Those who ran took the people around them with them, turning everyone into deserters so there would be no one to hold accountable. Only a few soldiers were still relatively clear-headed and realized they had a numbers advantage, while those who were running for their lives didn't care about anything except survival. Meanwhile, the Dawn Alliance watched excitedly as their enemies, who were several times stronger than them, were chased away, and the few people who tried to fight back were picked off one by Charles. "Kill those cowards!" a Dawn Alliance soldier shouted, and their troops stood to block the deserters' escape. A man wielding a long sword swung it forward and stopped them in their tracks. Seeing this person's seemingly invincible might, the deserters' retreating footsteps gradually slowed down. However, Their fear of the swordsmen was instantly overridden by the enemies chasing after them. "There are only a dozen or so people blocking the way, but there are tens of thousands of pursuers behind us," one of the deserters said to the other men. "Should we just plow through them?" "Take a detour and run," another shouted back. With this mentality, the deserters continued to run for their lives and scattered in all directions on their unstoppable retreat. Charles turned to the Dawn Alliance soldiers and said, "Capture some of the Neal family's martial artists so we can learn their secrets." This announcement sent a chill down the Neals' backs, while the soldiers who had surrendered to the Neals began to see opportunities opening up before them. Olivia, who was not far away from Charles, shouted, "We've long been at odds with the Neal family. Brothers, take your arms and let's slay them all." Inspired by her words, some of the paranormals began to join the fight. "Yeah, the Neal family put a knife to our necks," one said. "Let's attack together and finish them off." "I don't like the Neal family either," another added. "The Neal family treats us like cannon fodder and slaves," a third paranormal chimed in. "They don't take us seriously at all. We'll fight them to the death." And just like that, the Dawn Alliance's momentum toward victory became unstoppable. Charles felt himself break into a cold sweat when he saw their location on the map. He had known the Neal family hadn't cleaned up the area or scouted much during the time he had been asleep, but he was surprised that Kevin hadn't noticed any danger. The location they had chosen for the new survival base was less than 6 miles away from Stellar Technology. In an era where the human body was rapidly adapting, most people could cover the distance between the two bases in a relatively short period of time, putting the Dawn Alliance's base at a risk of a swift attack. Stellar Technology had amassed many resources using their signature high technology, and they dominated the whole region. Even though they were still at the beginning of their campaign, they already possessed immeasurable power. Although Charles wanted to settle the score with the technology company, he knew that it wasn't time to do so at that moment. He had been caught unawares, and would have never guessed that his own followers would build their new home on their enemy's doorstep. Despite his annoyance, he had to acknowledge that a certain degree of responsibility was his own. Stellar Technology had always been located near Montreal. Since the Neal family had discovered a spring nearby, Charles had wanted to be near to that, but he ought to have chosen their precise location in advance. Since he had wanted to allow Kevin some authority, he hadn't asked where exactly he had eventually settled on. Kevin had no idea that Stellar Technology was already established around the corner, so it was really Charles's fault for not warning him. In the end, Charles knew he had been overconfident in his own strength. He hadn't expected the Hive Queen, which had never appeared in his previous life, to show up in the fortress. When that surprise had been combined with his previous inability to break through to level 4, it had resulted in a frustrating situation. He decided it was too late to change his decision now. Since they were already settled, he didn't want to move everyone again. If he used the strongest people from the Alliance, he thought they might all be a match for Stellar Technology. "Kevin, Olivia, wake everyone up," he said. "Tell them to be on full alert, especially the people who joined us most recently. Let them know we're about to come under enemy attack. When you give the order, make sure that the military's combat unit soldiers are all hidden, and hide half of our original members. Don't let anyone know they're there. Kevin, make sure you cover your tracks when you hide them. It doesn't matter if it causes a disturbance in the Alliance." Kevin and Olivia nodded. Charles then said to Miranda, "There's no time to lose. Let's go." The two of them quickly headed out to search for Harper and the others. On the way, Charles's heart burned with anxiety. His cause for concern wasn't Zack and the others. He knew they were capable enough and weren't really in any danger. What he worried about was the reason Stellar Technology hadn't attacked them in the several days they had been at their new location. He thought it was probably because they didn't know how much strength the Alliance had. Transmitting information was a huge problem, and they would have been suddenly faced with a huge group of more than 20,000 people. He assumed their lack of intel on the Dawn Alliance would have made them feel uneasy at first. He almost laughed in amusement when he imagined the terrible Stellar Technology seeing the Alliance approaching like an army on the horizon. Now, though, it seemed they had realized the Alliance had no idea that Stellar Technology Base was there. The army had sent a combat unit to the Alliance. Charles was grateful, because he knew that it had likely served as an effective deterrent. It might even have given Stellar Technology the impression that the base was under the military's protection. Stellar Technology kept a low profile in the early stages, and they weren't likely to create a conflict with the Army over a base. They knew how to remain diplomatic. However, if they discovered that the base was only a product of the Alliance, they would attack it without any hesitation. At best, they would be slightly hesitant to fight against the soldiers. Therefore, Charles knew he needed to present a show of force. He knew that if he could somehow set up a trap and strike before Stellar Technology's main forces arrived on their doorstep, he might reduce the number of casualties. If the Stellar Technology forces were focused mainly on the base, and especially if they had already arranged spies within the Alliance, Charles thought that sending in a second smaller unit of people might be enough to confuse them and secure a win. Stellar Technology would also be unaware of how many paranormals he had. He knew it wasn't the ideal situation, but it could at least buy Olivia and the others some time. Hopefully it'll give me enough time to take control of the situation, he thought. Reaching Harper's location, which was just over 2 miles away, didn't take him and Miranda very long. Most people would have been able to run there within 20 minutes, but Charles and Miranda had the advantage of being faster than ordinary humans and having easy terrain to traverse. They thought they would make it there in 10. Miranda, wait a moment. After they had been running for 5 minutes, Charles called for her to stop. Although she was a little worried about his sudden order, she still stopped obediently. She knew that since he had agreed to take the risk of going without reinforcements, he wasn't about to retreat in the face of danger. She decided it was more likely that he had seen movement in front of them. Charles led her to a street corner and said, "Wait here, I'll be back soon." Without waiting for her to reply, he quickly climbed over a wall and went down a nearby street. Since he had finally broken through to the 4th level, the range of his spiritual strength perception exceeded 300 feet. He had stopped Miranda from running because he had noticed a couple of people sneaking down the street near a corner, and he had decided to take advantage of the situation. There were 5 small 6-person teams lurking around the vicinity. He decided to make it his goal to eradicate them all. The first team was keeping a wary eye on their surroundings as they moved forward quietly. They were silent as they made their way around, but they suddenly noticed a figure in front of them. They all exchanged a meaningful glance, and then one of them raised his gun. It was equipped with a silencer. However, they were immediately met by a huge ball of blue flames. They didn't have time to react before Charles had bowled them down like pins. He didn't destroy their bodies, and he didn't even confiscate their weapons, since those had been ruined by the fire. Instead, he purposely left their bodies lying around. He allowed the fire to burn itself out. He took out the second team and left traces of frostbite on their bodies. Where he could, he collected all of their weapons. He removed his jacket and threw it into his energy storage space. Then he changed into clothes he had taken from the fallen men and began to move around the city, taking out everyone he ran into. When he attacked the third team, he did so as quietly as possible using wind blades. Meanwhile, the people in the fourth team felt the ground open up beneath their feet, and the earth swallowed them whole, leaving a great chasm in the street. When he targeted the fifth squad, Charles blended in with them using the clothes he had taken. He snuck up behind each of them and took them out as quickly as possible with as many varied techniques as he could think of before they even knew he was there. Once he had completed his diabolical task, he returned to Miranda. "All right," he said triumphantly. "That should stop them from going through with their plan of ambushing us. If any others manage to find us, it shouldn't be too hard to take them down. Let's go and save Harper and the others."